the wall of sin, the wall of shame, the wall of hatred. And this thing will come down one day by the strong power of the people who will not accept that difference, that will find other ways to connect, to relate, to create possibilities for us to live together. This is not a way to do it. We have other possibilities and imagination and love and care for one another to create something else rather than this. It will come down. It will come down. We are here at the board of San Diego and Tijuana with Reverend John, and he's been so much involved with the border issues and also being a pastor of the United Methodist Church. So John, tell me something about you and your ministry and why you were so involved in this.
Yeah, thank you. I'm a native San Diegan, but like so many San Diegans, I didn't really know much about the border except for maybe going across to have a good party with my friends when I was a young man. But in 1992, I was ordained in the United Methodist Church and was appointed to serve a congregation in Calexico, California, which is a border town through and through. And so for those 4 years, I lived and worked on the border and fell in love with the people and the cultures of the borderlands. I've been back in San Diego now since 2004 and have been involved in immigrant and border work in a wide variety of capacities. I was the executive director of a social justice foundation for many years here in San Diego. And I also do a project where we serve communion at the U.S.-Mexico border each Sunday afternoon. So
you do each Sunday?
Each Sunday at a place called Friendship Park, which is a famous meeting place on the U.S.-Mexico border. So for many years have been involved with the people and places of the U.S.-Mexico border.
That's fantastic. So how do you connect the sacrament of the Eucharist with the borders?
So for me, the communion is a reminder that we belong to one family, the family of God, that we are brothers and sisters with each other, irrespective of our place of birth or our place of residence. And we serve communion through the U.S.-Mexico border fence each Sunday as a reminder that God's claim is greater on us than is the claim of the nation state. Así es.
And one more question. I think the wall is we could call it a wall of sin.
Yeah.
Do you think that we will ever be able to tear that down?
Yeah, aquí lo llaman el muro de vergüenza. It's a wall of shame. But I agree with you that es un muro de pecado también. It's a wall of sin. And I do think that in the long haul that it does not make sense, to have a wall. There's no rhyme nor reason to the wall being where it is. The population flow is such that the demography of our region here in the southwest of the United States, the northwest of Mexico, the demographics at the end of the day, I believe, will prove decisive. Who knows how long that will be?
That's right, but we'll keep our testimony, right, and our witness.
Absolutely.
John, thank you so much for your ministry.
Gracias. We can talk in greater length at any time you'd like around, the North American Free Trade Agreement, the globalization of the capitalist economy, and the reasons and rationale and why of this massive population, this massive population flow. In short, the North American Free Trade Agreement dislocated an extraordinary number of Mexican people, mostly by undermining traditional agricultural arrangements, right? Once the free market was opened up and American agricultural products were made available in Mexico, small-scale farmers in Mexico could no longer compete. They moved off their lands and they moved into cities. And the cities they moved into overwhelmingly were the northern cities. And the fastest growing of those cities, without any close comparison, were the cities on the border. So basically from 1980s into the 90s, into the 2000s, the northern cities of Mexico became the destination point for millions of Mexicans who were seeking out their fortune. And of course, some of those folks stopped and made a life for themselves in those border cities. Some of them kept coming.
I think so much further back. I feel like it's important to remember that this was Mexico. I mean, this was originally all part of the Spanish Empire, all the way up until the northern boundaries of California, and all of the Southwest, including where we're standing, once belonged to Spain, and Spain had claimed it as its new world empire. And then in 1848, after the Mexican-American War, which was instigated by some rebels in Texas, right? The Mexicans lost that war and negotiated a treaty, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848, that ceded effectively 55% of all of Mexico was ceded to the United States in that treaty. And that included most of what is now the southwestern states and California. So, you know, this is, for me, I have to think about it in those longer terms when we look at this, that we are actually historically standing in Mexico right now. And it is the politics of, you know, nation building that has moved the border. And the United States is, you know, hegemonic moves to, you know, create a nation that stretched from, you know, the East Coast all the way to the West. I mean, that was a sort of a doctrine virtually of the United States nation building project in the 1800s. And, you know, here we are standing and seeing the consequences.
Yes, correct.
It is. This is manifest destiny.
And it feels a lot more like Mexico with each passing day again now that we're, you know, and because more and more it's San Diego and Los Angeles and San Francisco, you know, these are the places where more and more people are understanding themselves to live, right?
Yes, yes.
And as Spanish, you know.
And they do become more Mexican.
Absolutely, profoundly so.
The irony.
Is there a detention center close by?
There is, about 6 miles to the east of where we are, over those hills. It's one of the largest. It houses about 6,500 people at a time.
Which one is this?
I was looking at Christian. Edwards, I think. No, Edwards is the Air Force Base. I can't remember the name of it.
And one thing to know about this bad mandates is because since it's privatized,
yes,
there is what is called within the system, it's called the bad mandate.
Well, yes.
Which is like they must have enough people to pay for the day. So they have to have people there.
34,000 people a night.
Wow.
So whatever come hell or high water, there are going to be 34,000 people in detention facilities at the end of the night because the Correction Corporations of America and the other subcontractors are and Congress mandated those numbers, as Congress mandated a bunch of other arbitrary numbers. 600 miles of wall. Where did 600 come from? Border Patrol didn't request it. There was no strategy or rhyme or reason to it. It was literally a number arrived at through negotiations and bickering and bartering, and finally somebody said, well, how about 600? And that was the piece of legislation that passed. So a huge, vast part of our border policies are crafted by people who, as we all know, don't know the first thing about the border, and who craft the policy on the border for consumption at home to their own political constituents.
Right. The fear.
Yeah, and those politics play extremely well, especially in a gerrymandered Congress, right? Where more and more Republicans have safe seats, Democrats too, but especially Republicans have safe seats, where their principal primary challenge is from the right, not right during the primary. Their principal electoral challenge is from the right in primary season instead of in the general election. So the incentive for Republican congressmen, mostly, and congresspeople, is to stake out that turf on the right wing, and a very safe and effective place, it's been proven, it works well in a lot of places for them to do that, is by, you know, demonstrating that they're tough on national security and that they're tough on the U.S.-Mexico border, never mind that those two things are barely related, and that they're tough on quote-unquote illegal immigration, right? So I did see that my favorite stat on this is that, you know, 1% of West Virginians are foreign-born. 1%.
Wow.
27% of Californians are foreign-born. So politicians and you know, people who are making their way in their political careers have such vastly different demographies to contend with and electorates to contend with, that their politics are shaped by, you know, well, what holds the best chance for them raising the necessary money and getting elected next election season. Really, huge amounts of money is spent along the border here, which really has no rhyme or reason to it in terms of, and many Border Patrol agents will even tell the same thing. They get a lot of mandates. They're like, well, I don't know why they told us to do this, but apparently we have to, you know, apparently we have to do it. So, and the underrepresentation of border communities in the halls of power is extreme. We have nowhere near the capacity, to represent the concerns of these communities before Congress. What other questions about this? No longer privately owned. Even the ones that are no longer privately owned are subcontracting out so much of the management that they become de facto private.
Private jail, right? Detention center.
I don't know that it's a very high. I don't know the percentage, but it's very high and it's been growing. So I don't know a precise number, but
Especially
yes.
if they were built in the last so many years, like in the last 5 years, I think mostly are
Sounds right to me.
private.
Our students in Palestine, we spend about half the time in Palestine and half the time in Israel. But mostly, actually, even when we're in Israel, in East Jerusalem, and we can't go, it's not safe. It's not safe. We are a multi-faith group. It's absolutely beautiful.
I don't believe it. It's not about any place.
I like this location because you can really get a close-up view of the border wall. We just came from the busiest land border crossing in the world, and the entire premise of U.S. border policy has been to try to funnel resources to these places of authorized crossing of goods and people, and to discourage unauthorized crossing between ports of entry. As I mentioned, the Imperial Beach station of the San Diego sector is 13 miles. So the westernmost 13 miles of the border proved very challenging when it came to this policy of hardening the border and preventing unauthorized crossings. The strategy, as was rolled out in the 1990s with Operation Gatekeeper here in the San Diego region, Operation Stone Garden, they called it in Arizona, Operation Hold the Line in Texas. These kind of major investments in U.S. border enforcement were concentrated on urban crossings, San Diego, Tijuana, El Paso, Juarez, Brownsville, Matamoros, because that's where the overwhelming amount of unauthorized crossings occurred. And that's logical if you put yourself in the shoes of somebody who wants to come into the United States without authorization. You'd much prefer to cross in an urban crossing. Why? Because once you're across there, you can blend into the crowd, right? So the strategy of the United States was to make it difficult to cross in these urban areas, and that, as a consequence, rerouted the traffic to the mountains and deserts of Eastern California and Arizona. And we've all heard about that changing flow, especially through the late 80s, accelerating in the 1990s and peaking in the early 2000s with people crossing in mass, especially through the deserts of Arizona. So whereas San Diego, Tijuana was for a long time by far and away overwhelmingly the busiest corridor, now it's the Tucson sector of Border Patrol with people crossing through the deserts. And we've all heard the stories about deaths. Nobody knows exactly how many, but hundreds and hundreds of deaths a year, easily exceeding 4,000 and probably 5,000, and potentially many more deaths than that across the last 2 decades. San Diego, Tijuana, the area around the port of entry was relatively easy to secure, the highways as we drove in and funneled to the port of entry. But to the west of the San Ysidro port of entry was land that had been cobbled together across decades by governments, city, county, state, and federal, to create a wildlife or an ecological preserve. The Tijuana estuary, as we'll hear at our next stop, is one of the few remaining coastal wetlands in which the native flora and fauna of the California coast is still preserved. So those of you who live in Southern California know that you can pretty much drive from here to, almost Santa Barbara, and it's one freeway exit after the other, right? Because it's developed. And the only exceptions to that really are the Camp Pendleton Marine Base in North County, San Diego, and the Tijuana Estuary, which has about 6.5, 7 miles of coast right here. So because you had, as you can see, a massive urban development, the city of Tijuana, there was no effort to preserve the estuary. So on the Mexican side of the wall, the city of Tijuana spread and built up completely as densely as you can possibly basically imagine right to the coast. So you had a major metropolitan population in-building extremely dense urban settlements across from a ecological preserve, and the nightmares of that you can imagine, and we'll hear much more at our next stop. In the meantime, Border Patrol and the Department of Homeland Security, I'm now talking post-2001, right? So post 9/11, reorganization of the federal government of the United States, consolidation of, I don't know how many, but dozens of agencies into the Department of Homeland Security, creating the largest federal agency in the government, I think, except for Department of Veterans Affairs. I'm not sure about that. Is it bigger? So DHS, the responsibilities of border enforcement were now, bureaucratically speaking, under the auspices of Department of Homeland Security. Immigration and Naturalization Services became Immigration and Customs Enforcement. Can you hear the change? And actually, the acronym is funny, INS and ICE, right? So INS became ICE. US became Customs and Border Patrol became Customs and Border Protection. And they were now being managed with a national security mandate. So enforcement policies on the US-Mexico border were being managed by people whose principal responsibility was homeland security and who fashioned border policy in that light. Considerable success, you may get they had trouble. So let me first describe the double triple wall system, and then we'll talk about why they had so much trouble getting it done. The metal panels are on the international boundary, which you can see across the hillside there, right? Those metal panels were put up, replacing kind of a heavy graded fence in the late 1980s and early 1990s. Those are retired landing mats from Gulf era warships. And when they decommissioned the warships, they took the landing mats off of the ships, they stored them, and when they stored them, they put numbers on them. When they pulled them out of storage and put them up on the wall, they put them up in sequence. So, I don't know, I heard Gulf era, whatever Gulf era, what does Gulf era mean, do you know? Maybe it, I think it was 90s though, so that would be pre-Baghdad? Could be. What's that? George I. I think it was the Gulf War. It'd be worth looking into. I think that dates to the 1990s, but I could be wrong. The panels are used, the panels and the numbers are used by Border Patrol to specify specific places on the border, right? Somebody jumped at panel 362, right? So the panels on the international boundary effectively create a grid, right, by which Border Patrol can manage unauthorized crossings. Of course, it's not hard to get over that first wall, and it's actually not that hard to get over the second wall either. But when it was just a primary wall, it didn't really accomplish very much, right? Very easy to get over. People were still jumping the fence and rushing into San Diego in large numbers. This strategy of a double wall or a triple wall then was implemented in the following fashion and for the following reasons. The U.S. government took from other property holders the land adjacent to the international boundary. So land that previously had belonged to the state of California or the county of San Diego was claimed by the federal government, eminent domain, seized it, condemned it is the other language, and then there was a very complex process, which I don't actually understand, of compensating the landholders. In Texas, you heard stories of family land holdings getting chopped up. But anyway, by seizing the land adjacent to the international boundary, the federal government is able to claim the land as federal property and impose an enforcement regime or strategy on that land without any complication or hindrance, right? So the land, from about where we're standing, I think we're right at the federal, see that chain link fence? See the little chain link fence that comes to a dead end right at that road? That is the federal property line. And you actually, if you let your eye go up the hillside, you see how the chain link fence serpentines its way up the, that's the federal property line. Everything south of that chain link fence is federal property. And if you step across it, you will get chased off. And there are probably signs posted there that says U.S. property, U.S. federal property, no trespassing, right? So anything that happens on the south side of the federal property line, which is sometimes marked with a chain link fence or some other kind of barrier, is entirely within the purview of federal agents. They have complete and utter control of what goes on inside there. By creating a secondary wall, which you see right here in front of us, by creating a secondary wall and by paving a high-speed patrol road on one side or sometimes both sides of the secondary wall, can you see the paved road? You create the capability for Border Patrol vehicles to speed at extremely high rates of speed from one point to another. So our friend here on the ATV, if he's on that other side of the fence on that decomposed granite road, he is probably responsible for, I don't know how much, but a swath of this border. And by putting cameras, motion detectors, ground sensors, and a whole host of other technological apparatus, one agent is able to patrol a really wide stretch of border, because if somebody jumps, it's not that it's so hard to get over these walls, but if somebody were to jump there, and before they would be able to get over that second wall, a Border Patrol agent would receive notice and would speed, as they say, from point A to point B and apprehend the person before they got any further. No, but we're not on federal property, so no, I did not. Yeah. Yeah, so you shouldn't let them do that to you. And you're, as long as you're on San Diego County land, you're good. And that fence is the property line.
I'm pretty sure that's what
Yeah.
they showed up.
Yeah,
Yeah,
no, they can't do that. Don't let them do it to you next time. So you can, if we, like I think our photographer just jumped down. Our photographer probably just went on federal property. Well done. And had he stayed there, they could kick him off of that, but they can't kick you off of land that isn't theirs. So this system, ridiculously, the system is actually quite effective. It really is a very effective system of discouraging unauthorized crossings at very specific locations, right? It effectively reroutes the traffic, right?
Now I've heard that
Yes.
this also has cut animal migratory routes.
Very much so. And we'll hear more about...
the opening, is the fact that...
No. I don't know the particular
designed
ecology. The ecology is very different at different swaths along the border. And our next stop at the Estuary Valley, we'll hear first from some experts about the ecological impact. And it has been both on the topography and on the animal life. So in other parts of the border in Texas, I know there are huge issues around migratory species. Most of the migratory species along here, I think, are birds, which have their unique capacity to get across. Yeah. So the problem was that the border wall in the early 2000s was built out really almost to where the guy on the ATV was. And you can see, if you let your eye follow to the east, you can see the brown metal fence. See how it moves to a very straight line and climbs that hillside in the distance? And then if you see the secondary wall, you see how it kind of serpentines its way through this urban corridor of San Ysidro, and then picks up again on the other side and weaves its way up the top of the... So the second border wall, I've heard different numbers on this. Some are anywhere from 90 to 180 feet, kind of depending on where they need to build and where the best path for it is. But between those two walls is what they call a theater of operations, or a zone of enforcement, over which they have complete and utter control. And it's very effective for them. It's very useful because, in this language they also like to use, it's uncluttered. It's an uncluttered theater of operations. They can speed at 70 or 80 miles an hour without having to worry that anybody is in there hiking around or, holding a party or doing anything of that sort.
If you go out to the airport, right?
Airport's that way, and the Friendship Park that way, yeah. Okay,
and there used to at least be sort of a corrugated wall, but now there's also several layers there, right?
Yes.
Where those crosses are.
Yes.
So they've done the same kind of.
I know the number. The number I hear is that there are some kind of barriers on about 660 of the border's 2,000 miles. And the type of barrier varies according to the strategy of Border Patrol. So in some places, like in more remote regions, the principal barriers are vehicle barriers, where their real goal is they're not so much worried about foot crossings, but they erect these barriers that prevent trafficking of narcotics, for instance, by vehicles. In urban corridors, they're more preoccupied with foot traffic And they typically, these double or triple layers of different configuration and different kinds. I don't know the sum total, but I think it's upwards of 100 or 150 miles.
Do they shoot if somebody
No.
see somebody?
No, by no means. By no means.
I feel like I've heard stories of
There have
people.
been about 30 deaths at the hands of Border Patrol agents across the last decade. There have been a couple of instances where Border Patrol agents have actually shot into Mexico. And there are a couple of cases. So when I said by no means, I said in no way, shape, or form is that policy. And any such incidents would quickly be identified by Border Patrol officials themselves as unapproved and unauthorized. They do carry weapons, of course they do.
But I also heard about rape also.
So the questions of Border Patrol abuse are very big and a very pervasive concern among border communities. And a big campaign, which was actually the new head of Customs and Border Protection just a couple of months ago released a really damning document about issues of accountability and control internal to Border Patrol. So even high-ranking Border Patrol officials themselves are beginning to, what it amounts to fessing up about again, I'm sure there have been instances. We know there have been instances of rape. We know there have been instances of shooting. So, and we also know that those are outlier forms of misconduct, and the range of misconduct is great and widespread. So, and a big part of that had to do with hiring, which is why so many people are worried about Mike Obama's announcement last night that in conjunction with the executive action to exercise prosecutorial discretion is going to come this whole new flood of Border Patrol agents to the border region. Well, the problem with Border Patrol over the last 15 years is that Congress set for them these random and arbitrary hire goals. They had no other capacity to hire people, vet people, screen people, train people. They were bringing huge amounts of guys in out of the Gulf Wars, people, in fact, who thought they were transferring their military experience to the border. They were told to go patrol a theater of operations, and it was huge. It was a huge problem. So by their own admission, they've had huge problems with staffing up and appropriately training agents in the numbers that they've been asked to. And it looks like we may well be headed for yet more, which will only create more of these kinds of problems. And I don't mean to dismiss or diminish the concerns of the extreme cases of abuse which do exist. And there's some excellent organizations who are doing an incredible job of watchdogging the Border Patrol on precisely these fronts. But I do think the larger problem is kind of a pervasive culture of poor training and poor accountability. That's really at the root of it. And that includes the immigration and customs enforcement at ports of entry, right? So as it became more difficult to cross, the traffic rerouted into the more remote regions of the border. And the other thing that became much more effective in terms of crossing without authorization was to move through ports of entry with falsified documents. So the price goes up, right? 15 years ago, you're in Tijuana, $250, and 36 hours later, you're in Los Angeles. It was in many ways, it was a very rational market. It worked very well. It was orderly. People kind of knew how it worked, and it was kind of, matter of fact. Now you're in Tijuana, you're going to pay upwards of $5,000, depending on what kind of method and who you want to trust and hire. And what that did was it meant that getting people into the United States illegally suddenly became a very profitable business. So the same criminal organizations that historically traffic drugs or other kind of contraband have gone into the people moving business because there's money to be made, right? And similarly, it became much more reasonable from a business model perspective to invest, for instance, in really, really slick falsified documents, right? So if you have to invest $1,000 in or you have to buy a legitimate, say, passport off of somebody for $1,000, that's not a bad investment if your actual fee is $6,000, right? So unauthorized crossing shifted from between ports of entry to remote areas between ports of entry where you're hiking days through the desert, and also shifted greatly to fraudulent entries through ports of entry. And that also increased dramatically cases of Border Patrol corruption. Border Patrol agents who are on the tape and bought off to facilitate these entries with false papers. So a guy who works with human rights in Tijuana took me once to a guy who had worked as a coyote. We had a group about this size, and he was sitting at a table, and he pulled out of his satchel about 30 pieces of identification. They were passports and visas and tourist student visas and border crossings, and he picked out one of the girls in the group. They were young college age, a young woman, and he started picking up his documents going like this. We'll go with this one. He had found a piece of ID, which he had these pieces of ID that he had bought off of people. He had rented legitimate forms of ID from people. He found one that matched her approximate physical description. And he said, we'll send you through next Thursday at 8 p.m. and you'll go through line 13 at the San Diego Port of Entry. And on line 13, the San Diego Port of Entry is a Border Patrol agent who he has on the take. And what that system did is it provides plausible deniability to that Border Patrol agent, right? If his supervisor, and there's, they're getting watched, very, very closely by supervisors because all the IDs are screened and it comes up on screens. But if his supervisor comes chewing down the chain on him, which is unlikely to happen, he's able to say, listen, she presented me a legitimate form of ID and she fit the physical description and she answered my questions correctly. How was I to know? So that kind of dynamic of corruption among Border Patrol was also an extreme problem during the phase of rapid hire. And they're doing kind of an ongoing job of trying to clean house to varying degrees of success. Or I hear varying stories about how successful they're actually being in that. And the thought of them having to ramp up and hire a whole new 20,000, I think Obama said, whatever, it's ridiculous. It's totally beyond the capability of the organization to manage well. So to finish this story, the secondary wall, the double triple wall layer, federal property, complete control is actually a very effective deterrent. It kind of breaks down in heavy fog. So when the coastal fog rolls in, the motion detectors and the cameras basically go, and so traffic really picks up then. And there's some very effective techniques of getting over these walls. Those pylons, for instance, are just the right width to wedge a tire in between. So we know people climb this wall during times of fog because every time there's a fog rolls in, at the end of the night you find like 3 tires wedged in. You could jam 3 tires between those, and you create a ladder, and you're over it in a matter of seconds, right? So at the end of the day, when a lot of my friends in the immigrant rights crowd, they say, oh, build a 20-foot wall and they'll make a 21-foot ladder, and there's some truth in that, but that diminishes the degree to which this methodology is actually very effective at deterring unauthorized crossings. The big problem they had was that they weren't able to finish the second wall out to the coast because of environmental regs through the internationally recognized wetlands of the Tijuana estuary and an ecological preserve subject to all these environmental laws and regulations. So the second wall for years ended about right here, down there, and then from here on out was still a little bit kind of the free-for-all of the early 90s with people racing their way through and high levels of crossing at night. So in 2005, Congress passed the Real ID Act, which had to do with false documentation or regularizing the use of documents. And they appended to that a rider which gave the Secretary of Homeland Security the authority to waive any and all these laws deemed necessary to expedite construction of the remaining border wall. So in 2005, Michael Chertoff waived about 35 environmental and labor regulations, just wiped them off the book. The language is fantastic. It says, I reserve the right to waive any and additional laws as I may deem necessary. And the last 3.5 miles, the last 3.5 miles was built on what were called design-build contracts, where these companies were given contracts where they were not, usually a federal contract I've learned is you design it, you bid on it, you design it, it's reviewed, and then you have to bid again on the construction, which is reviewed. These were design-build contracts, and they threw up the last 3.5 miles of wall here in San Diego incredibly fast. This is basically between 2008 and the beginnings of 2010. In 18 months, it just went out. We know the first contract they signed was $57 million, and we know it wasn't the last contract they signed. And we know it was $7 million to build a new border wall out into the ocean. So at minimum, at bare minimum, they spent $65 to $70 million on the last 3.5 miles of wall. And all of that contracting was done on these design-build contracts over which there was no public review of any kind. Nobody has ever still seen the contracts. So the border wall business and the border infrastructure business is big business, the border industrial complex, as some people call it. And the companies, just like the private corporation, the private companies that are running the prisons, the private companies that are building and maintaining border wall are making huge amounts of money, and largely out of anything that approximates the kind of public review that we're used to seeing with federal contracts. So at the end of the day, when they finished the 3.5 miles to the border, to the beach, finally the San Diego Border Patrol had this Imperial Beach station, the last 13 miles of border pretty much locked down with either double walls and or the whole infrastructure that surrounds the port of entry. And there you have what many people and with reason would argue as a 21st century border with increased flows of authorized goods and people through the ports of entry, and a very much more difficult and complicated means of moving anything across the border between ports of entry. I feel like that was a lot. Sorry.
Is there
Thank
anything
you.
saying that or that it has made it
Profound. Well, again, you have to think of in microcosm it works extremely well. San Diego is now one of the least crossed borders along the entire length of the border. So again, the capability to actually deter crossings at specific locations is great. They really do know how. They can't stop it altogether, but they do know how to radically. And the guy who I know in Tijuana who works on this, he's studies this stuff professionally, and he's really been on the ground for a long time. He says nobody in their right mind, only crazy people try to cross here because it doesn't make any sense. Your chances of apprehension are so extremely high. And again, that calculus changes a little bit when fog or weather happens. But it does. They are very successful in proportionally rerouting, right? So that's why you have people in Congress penciling out how much it would cost to build 2,000 miles of this, right? Because their dream vision would be to build this kind of infrastructure along the entire 2,000-mile length of the border, and wouldn't that be wonderful? We'd finally, shut the border down, quote unquote.
What about the tunnels?
Tunnels became viable too, right? So you're basically changing the economics, right? Suddenly, an investment in a tunnel to move contraband, especially narcotics. There's some people moving tunnels, but out east of where we are, Otay Mesa, over that hill, and out actually south of the church where Christian's church is really it's huge industrial warehouses. And the port of entry out there, the Otay Mesa port of entry, is principally a commercial vehicle. I think it's the largest commercial vehicle crossing now in North America. I think between the U.S. and Mexico, a huge number of container vehicles go through. And the land on the north side of the border is all these warehouses, right? So over the last decade, I don't know how many, but several dozen of these tunnels have cropped up. Where the tunnel has begun in Tijuana, gone under the border, and cropped up in one of these warehouses in Otay Mesa. And some of them are very sophisticated. I can't remember one 800 feet long and lit with a rail car for moving, moving the stuff along. So, the criminal organizations, and the Border Patrol, I've heard them give their spiel on this. They talk about how incredibly adaptive and creative the criminal organizations have been as they've rolled out one strategy and as these organizations have adapted to the new lay of the land. So,
Thank you.
Morning session, we chatted by Skype with one of our partners in Tijuana. San Diego Tijuana was the main corridor for traffic south to north for the better part of 30 years, in the 70s through the mid-2000s. It is now the principal venue for traffic from north to south, consisting of people who have been deported. And the population of deportees in Tijuana has exploded across the last 10 years. A huge number of people who are deported, especially if they still have strong family and emotional connection to the United States, do not return to their places of origin in the interior of Mexico, but set up shop in the northern border cities. So all the northern border cities have population growth these days is from deportees. So I've been working for many years at a place called Friendship Park, where we serve communion each Sunday afternoon in partnership with some friends in Tijuana. So we consecrate the elements and serve to people on both sides of the border at this meetup place called Friendship Park, which is right above the ocean, right where the border wall dives into the Pacific Ocean. And over the last couple of years, we've folks who have been coming to the Sunday communion on the Mexican side have almost consist entirely of people who have been deported. And that population, a number of them have organized support groups. So the two particular groups that we're most involved with is a group of deported veterans. These are U.S. veterans who, after their discharge, got into trouble with the law, and before they were able to regularize their status, they entered the U.S. military with the promise of citizenship at the tail end. But but when they were discharged, they ran afoul of the law and were therefore deported. So around 200 deported U.S. veterans living in Mexico, the majority of them right here in Tijuana. And they've established a support house. It's both a support group and a kind of a resource center for people like themselves who have been deported from the U.S. And the other is a group of mothers. They call themselves Dreamers Moms. These are mothers of especially Dreamers, kids who, their kids received deferred action under Obama's first action, but they themselves did not, and they were subsequently deported. They have a list of about 150 such women right now in Tijuana, and they similarly have organized into kind of a support group and advocacy group for their cause. They're very active on social media, so if you wanted to learn more about them, you should just go to Facebook, look for Deported Veterans Support House or Dreamers Moms USA Tijuana, or connect with me. I'm glad to connect you with them. And you can see the kind of the grassroots organizing that they're doing in Tijuana to try to offer support to people who have been deported. An estimated homeless population is in Tijuana is upwards of 10,000, and at least a half of those are people who have been deported. So a great many people when they're deported, as you can imagine, suffer all kinds of trauma and shock and acculturation problems, and many are deported with grave problems to begin with, right? Including drug and alcohol addiction and other problems. So a huge number of people who are deported in Tijuana end up homeless and on the streets or living in the Tijuana River Canal. There are several thousand people living in the riverbed, a cemented riverbed in extreme conditions. There's tons of both faith-based and community-based organizing and advocacy around the deported population in Tijuana. And that's kind of where in a tiny sliver of it is related to stuff that we've done through our Ministry of the Border Church. You all know you understand the politics of it. Why has it made sense for both Republican and Democratic administrations to pursue this policy of border enforcement? It's been very bipartisan, utterly consensual across Clinton. Really launched in the whole game was really launched in the Clinton era, right? So Clinton, Bush, and Obama have all pursued effectively the same strategy of border enforcement. And the rationale for both was that they believed it to be a necessary precondition to comprehensive immigration reform. Right? That to get anything like immigration reform through Congress, and to get anything, the prospect of Republican votes in support of immigration reform, they were going to have to show that they were tough on the border, right? So across the last, right, so across 20 years, both parties have pursued the same policies with equal vigor. Obama, in some respects, with more vigor than anybody before him, right? In terms of deportations, the deporter-in-chief, as he was labeled by some advocates. Because the assumption, the end game has always been, well, yes, we have to do this, but we have to do this in order to be able to pass some kind of comprehensive immigration reform legislation. As we now know, 20 years of investment in that policy did not yield the desired result. And so, and meanwhile, folks along the border have lived with, and this is more to the point that you were alluding to earlier, Helene, that people living along the border have lived in an environment of extreme, label it what you want, militarization or enforcement, or and the presence of Border Patrol and the pervasive presence of the enforcement apparatus along the border communities has just continually escalated across the reshaped and the cultural landscape and all the rest. A very profound change.
It is really too bad that we can't go to Friendship Park, where for me you can most clearly have the sense of life on the other side of the wall, through which you can see tiny little holes, and you just are overwhelmed with the sense that this should just not be here, and we should be allowed to walk that beach, and on the Mexican side they should be allowed to walk that beach the full length. And, there are also these old pictures, I think, of Pat Nixon, something like 72 or so. She's here at there's a marker that is a boundary marker right at Friendship Park that was erected, I don't know how long ago.
1840, 1850.
It comes from the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, when they actually mapped out the boundary at that point. And there's a sort of iconic photo of Pat Nixon visiting, and there's nothing there, just this little boundary obelisk, boundary marker, and her and some other folks in a Photoshop.
The slang that Mexicans use to describe the border, you can capture the evolution of the border, because in Spanish on the streets in northern Mexico, any of these words work equally for the border. They're functionally equivalent. Frontera, which y'all get what that is, right? And what does that word connote for us? Frontera or frontier? Kind of wide open space, right? So the border in Spanish is una frontera. Es una línea, a line, because that was the first thing that was done. They had to draw a line, which they marked with these monuments. Es un cerco, a fence, una cerca, fence, because for a long time there was fences of different kinds, chain link fences, barbed wire fences. And now es un muro, a wall, it's a wall. All those things in a common vernacular, and un doble muro, a double wall, all that's common vernacular on the streets of northern Mexico, because you know the border has evolved over the 170 years since it was drawn and taken on these different configurations, right? So, and it is a shame. I apologize that this tour isn't capturing anything like the life and culture of. So really, it was a tour more of border lands than border peoples, as I said. And I hope you'll have occasion to come back sometime and get to spend some time in Tijuana or get out to Friendship Park. You're welcome to join any Saturday and Sunday, 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. Friendship Park is open, and you can catch a little glimpse of this binational spirit.
The wall of sin, the wall of shame, the wall of hatred. And this thing will come down one day by the strong power of the people who will not accept that difference, that will find other ways to connect, to relate, to create possibilities for us to live together. This is not a way to do it. We have other possibilities and imagination and love and care for one another to create something else rather than this. It will come down. It will come down.